This is Dr. Jason, Revolution Network, and today I am with a gentleman we talked beforehand briefly, someone who I kind of call myself, I say that I have a lot of mentors in life because whether I know the person directly or I just follow them, they've been mentors in my political, health, geopolitical world because I followed them, read their books, and they're good information. And this gentleman is one of those people to me. John Perkins, first of all, welcome to the show. I appreciate you being on.
Thank you, Jason. You're a great show, and I'm very honored to be on.
Well, I appreciate it as well. And you are such a leader around the world, whether you know it or not. Your book obviously was a bestseller, and it's phenomenal. And I think, now, correct me if I'm wrong, I counted, I believe you have, is it 6 books out right now?
10.
Oh, so I was going through all your book lists, and I'm going, wow, okay, this, and I realized, because obviously I stumbled upon you. I was saying before, I stumbled upon you with Ron Paul because I went down this whole geopolitical rabbit hole from a standpoint of, why do we attack other countries? Why do other countries attack us? And then I stumbled upon you years and years and years ago, but at the time, when I saw, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, I thought that was your only work. And then after going into it, I'm like, wow, this guy actually is a amazing author, very profound information you have. Can you give everyone, we're going to go into your book because I want to touch on several different things when it comes to your latest book out. Everything from natural healing, which I'm into, to actual political and planetary healing, which we all obviously need. But I want you to give everyone a little background and a summary on what you did as an economic hitman, because it's all coming out right now in the world we're living in, and how you operated before your consciousness.
Yeah, so back to the book. There's 5 books on shamanism and indigenous people, because I kind of started there as a Peace Corps volunteer in the Amazon after I got out of business school. And then there's 4 books on global economics, and now this new one, which is the 10th book. When I was in the Peace Corps from 1968 to 71 in Ecuador, most of the time in the Amazon, some of the time in the Andes. And then I went back to what I've been trained to do in business school. I became an economist, and I quickly rose to chief economist at this major Boston-based consulting firm. My job was really that of an economic hitman, and what I was supposed to do, and I had a large staff that helped me did a lot of the grunt work for me, but my job was to identify countries with resources that corporations want, like oil, and then arrange huge loans to that country from the World Bank or one of its sister organizations, or U.S.-controlled organizations, basically. But the money didn't go to the country. Instead, it went to our own corporations to build big infrastructure projects in the country. So our corporations made huge profits, and they built power plants and industrial parks and highways and so on and so forth. And, I was under the impression that we were helping raise the prosperity of everyone in the country. That was the perception I had. And the book, Touching the Jaguar, one of the basic themes is that we create reality through molding perceptions. And, my life's a great example of that, because businesses are in the business of creating reality through perceptions, marketing, selling whatever it is. And in my case, I was selling to these countries the idea that they needed to go deep into debt to hire our corporations. And in the end, they couldn't pay off the debt. So we'd go back and say, since you can't pay your debt, sell your oil real cheap to our corporations without any environmental or social regulations, or privatize and sell off your major public sector businesses like your schools and your prisons and your utility companies to our investors. But at the beginning, what I thought was that this was a really good thing we were doing, because the perception is that when you invest a lot of money in infrastructure in poor countries, the economy grows. And statistically, we can show that that's true. The GDP grows. That's the statistic we use. But over time, I began to discover that the GDP is not a statistic that reflects overall economic growth. It reflects the growth of a few wealthy families, basically in most of these countries. So, for example, if you take the United States, Jason, right now, 3 individuals have as much wealth as half the population. If those 3 individuals made 10% on their investment last year, and half the country lost 3%, we'd still show an overall GDP growth of something slightly under 5%. But that would not be a measure of prosperity in the country because half the country's lost 3%. And so GDP is a lousy measure. It's not a measure of overall prosperity. It's a measure of, certain aspects of the economy, but those reflect the very rich. And so over time, I began to see that what I was doing was not at all what I thought I was doing or what I perceived we were doing. What we were really doing was colonizing these countries and creating an economic system that we call a death economy, an economic system that really exploits other people and resources. And in the process, it destroys the environment, it destroys lives, and it destroys the resources upon which the industries depend on the long term. And it's based on one perception, and that is the perception that the business of business is to maximize short-term profits regardless of the social and environmental costs, regardless of the long term. And when you think about it, that's a very unsatisfactory economic model. It's one that's doomed to fail ultimately, and it is failing us. And so it's time to turn that around and create a life economy. We can go into that in more detail if you want, but that's the short version of what I did for 10 years as an economic hitman until I realized that what I was doing was not at all what I thought I was doing.
Yeah, and it's so funny because I talk regularly to my viewers about things like central banks, the Rothschilds, this whole thing, and how this machine actually works behind the scenes. And it's very interesting because I grew up in that world. I grew up thinking that that's how the world operates, and it's so fascinating that you talk about perceptions equal reality, and so many people don't really fully understand that. And we, for the longest time, in America especially, because I have traveled not nearly as much as you have, but I've traveled overseas, and the perception over there about the world, the planet, and even America is so different than what we get from our quote-unquote mainstream media. And whether you have a liberal or a conservative channel on, you're getting this perception in reality. Can you talk to a little bit of that? Because we even have a majority of Americans right now who are still, I consider, fully asleep to the fact that we're getting pushed propaganda every single day.
Yeah, so the propaganda is a way of creating reality through changing perceptions. So, I learned when I was a Peace Corps volunteer, I was, at one point I got very, very sick, deep in the jungle. It was a 3-day hike through dense forest and then an awful bus ride up to 10,000 feet altitude to the nearest medical facility. I couldn't do it. A shaman healed me. And basically, he took me on this shamanic journey where I saw this jaguar.
Right.
Touching the jaguar.
Yeah, I love it.
This jaguar. and I'm on this, traumatic journey, like a vision quest. This was 1969. I didn't even know what a shaman was, but I'm on this journey. And at some point he says, touch the jaguar. And I look all around like, I'm in the deep jungle. It's night. Where's the jaguar? And he says, no. Close your eyes and touch the jaguar you see. And this jaguar I saw had a voice. And the voice said, son, the food and drink will kill you. And it was like the voice of my mother. And at that moment, I realized that I was eating very, very strange foods, in my opinion. It was things like living, squirming white grubs. Delicacy for the people I was living with. And they don't drink water, river water, because they know the rivers are dangerous to drink. It's organic matter, so all the falling trees and leaves. And so the women make a kind of beer called chicha by chewing and spitting manioc root. And when they spit it, and it sets up this fermentation process, turns into an alcohol. Then you can add water. Well, you got to drink a lot of spit beer because you got to be hydrated in the jungle. And on this journey, I saw that every time I ate these foods or drank the spit beer, I heard this voice saying it'll kill you, and that was a perception. It took me into feeling to sickness. The jaguar, at the same time, when I touched it in that vision quest, it showed me how incredibly robust and healthy the Shuar are. I mean, they're hunters and gatherers. They're really tough, strong people, vital. And they live to be very old if they're not killed in a hunting accident or something like that. And so that night I saw that it was the perception that was killing me. And then the shaman asked me to be his apprentice. Basically, that was his. They were non-currency system. They didn't. It was all barter, so I couldn't pay him anyway except to become his apprentice. And in that apprenticeship, he said to me, he said, touching the jaguar means that you identify your barriers, your jaguars, your fears, whatever it is, and then you identify them, and then you reach out, you confront them. You don't run from them. You don't hide from them. You confront them. And when you do that, changes your perception. And then that gives you energy to take the actions that you need to change. And so that's where the title of this book, Touching the Jaguar, comes from. But it's also this whole business of how we change. And if we look at the economy today, the way to change from a death economy that's failing us to an economy that can be successful, which we might call a life economy, is we change the perception that the goal is no longer to maximize short-term profits or short-term consumption of individuals, but it's to maximize long-term benefits for people and nature, and our long-term love of life, not just the immediate gratification of running to a store and buying something because you heard on television. That's what you ought to do. This business that you mentioned, the propaganda thing, we don't have to listen to that. But it's a very powerful form of changing reality through changing perceptions.
100%. What now? Kind of take me back, because I'm curious about this, and it's so fascinating how you made this shift from obviously the world of the economics and running around the globe, doing things that at first you thought were the right thing to do. And in my world of healthcare, sometimes people take medications or they get vaccinated because at the time, that's the information they have, that's the perception they have, so they go ahead and do it. And it's understandable because that's what they know. Versus then it's almost like everyone has an awakening moment to where they realize, wait a second, this is not necessarily right. There's an easier way to do this. There's a healthier way to live. There's a better way to run a country. There's a better way to run the planet. Was there a moment where you just had this clicking moment? I know you obviously were with the shamans and things like that, where you went, oh man, I have to change. This is not something that I agree with, or I understand how this machine is working.
Yeah. So after I got out of the Peace Corps, and I'd been through 3 years living with these indigenous people, I went back to doing what I'd been trained to do, being an economist and doing what I thought was right, as I've explained earlier. But so I did that for 10 years, and for the first at least half, maybe 6 or 7 years, I thought I was doing the right thing. And then I began to see the truth behind this, that those measurements of GDP, et cetera, were not correct, that what we were telling the world we were doing of improving lives in these countries, we weren't really doing that. We were just improving the wealth of a few rich families, basically, and our own corporations. But once I saw that, I didn't want to admit it. I didn't want to touch that Jaguar because I was making a lot of money. I was traveling first class around the world. I seemed to be living the American dream. But over time, my conscience bothered me more, and I realized I really wasn't very happy. And then, during my 10th year in that job, I took a vacation. I rented a sailboat in the Virgin Islands, and I anchored off St. John Island, and I rowed the dinghy ashore. I climbed up on this hill to an old sugar plantation. It was beautiful. It was the ruins of a sugar plantation. There were lots of bougainvillea, beautiful flowers. I sat there looking out at the sun setting over the Caribbean. It was idyllic. And then it struck me that this plantation, that seemed so idyllic, had been built on the bones of thousands of slaves. And then I had to realize that the whole hemisphere has been built on the bones of millions of slaves, not just ones from Africa, but also Native Americans. And then I had to admit that I too was a slaver. Very different kind of slavery. I'm not trying to make a comparison, but I was enslaving people in debt and this type of colonialism. And at that moment, I made the decision I would never do it again. And I went back after that and quit my job, and then essentially have devoted most of the rest of my life to trying to turn that system around, and knowing that I understand the system quite well as an insider. I speak the language. I can go out and talk to corporate executives. I speak at some big international economic forums. It's kind of shocking to me that, having written the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman, I'm invited to do all these things, but I found a very positive reaction from many business executives and world leaders, and even at the World Bank. So it's been an interesting journey. But there was that, there was a lead up And I think that's important for all of us as we go through touching our Jaguar. There's probably usually kind of a lead up, and then suddenly there's this moment when I had this moment of inspiration, of enlightenment, of realizing the thing about slavery. And I think for many of us, we reach this moment. And in fact, in the book, I suggest about a 10-minute process people can do every day or once a week, whatever they want, which helps them to move into really getting in touch with that side of each of us as individuals, no matter what we do. We can be a writer or a podcast host like you, or a plumber, or a parent, or a carpenter, or a teacher, or whatever we are. Each one of us can really go into that moment of enlightenment by doing this kind of a practice thing. It's kind of the equivalent of that vision quest that I had that night.
Nice. I have a friend who I've talked to behind the scenes who also interviewed you, and he told me to ask you the Venezuela, Ecuador, Reagan story. If you're able to give us that story.
The Venezuela, Ecuador, Reagan.
Ronald
story.
Reagan story. If you think of it, no big deal.
I'm not sure what he was referring to, but certainly, Reagan took us into this idea of top-down
economics.
That this whole idea that if we reduce taxes on the rich, it'll benefit everybody. But that's just false. And again, it may show an increase in GDP because the GDP is so balanced that way, but it doesn't filter down through the system. And the Venezuela was very much based on that situation. And some of Milton Friedman, who won the Nobel Prize in economics in 1976, and he's the guy that you could credit most with this current system. And it was building up for a long time before then, but in 1976, he won the Nobel Prize in economics, and he said the only responsibility of business is to maximize short-term profits. And he said if we do that, all the social and environmental problems will be taken care of. It was absurd, but Reagan really bought into it and brought Friedman in as advisor. So did the administration that at that time was a dictatorship in Venezuela, and Chile and other places brought in Milton Friedman to do that kind of work. Ecuador did the same thing. Ecuador was run by a military junta at the time, and so this idea really took foothold throughout the hemisphere, throughout much of the world. Margaret Thatcher brought in Milton Friedman. She worshipped him in a way. And while Friedman said a lot of good things, he was a brilliant economist, but he said that one statement he made, which really pushed us over the precipice into this death economy, the idea that if you take care of the short term, the long term will be okay, which is contrary to human life on this planet as we know it. We've been human beings for roughly 250,000 years, as we know ourselves, and during most of that time, we've lived with the idea that we have to make things better for our children and our grandchildren. Most human societies throughout history, including indigenous ones, and they're all indigenous at one point, had this long-term view of taking care of resources, the idea of the seventh generation, that sort of thing. It's only been relatively recently. And Milton Friedman can be credited with really pushing that to the limit. And it's turned out to be insanity. It's, the death economy is behind most of the crises we face today. Things like climate change and income inequality, the racial tensions that we're experiencing now, the coronavirus, species extinctions, all these are serious problems. But they're symptoms of the bigger problem, and the bigger problem is this economic system. It's a governmental, social economic system, really, that's failing us, and we've got to turn it around. We've got to make that transition into a life economy, and I think we're in the process of doing it. I'm very hopeful. It only takes a change of perception, and then a lot of work to take the actions necessary to put that perception into effect.
I 100% agree. It's actually fascinating you said that because in the healthcare world that I deal with from a natural healthcare standpoint, I'm actually reading a book called Target Africa right now, which is kind of going into the quote unquote neo-colonialism where we basically went around to different countries and we were stealing resources and doing different things like that. And we were suppressing peoples of all, and I also am in nutrition. And so one of my mentors that I read, who's long since passed, talked about indigenous peoples and all over the planet who didn't understand what cancer was, didn't understand what all these modern industrialized diseases were because they're living from the land. They're actually having a proper economy, whether that was barter or some sort of other type of money that they used. But really, we need to go back to kind of that, even though we have a lot more people, we could find a way to create that kind of, not necessarily utopia, but a more ideal world. So I really love your viewpoints on that. And I think it's very forward thinking, but in reality, it's knowing what you went through and what you saw, which was fascinating. Now your book, Touching the Jaguar, which I think the book cover alone is awesome because it kind of like brings your whole world together the way I look at it, your past year to where you are now and how you look into the future. Give us some background on what this book was about and why you wrote it.
Yeah, since you mentioned the cover, let me hold it up here for a moment.
I love
because
it.
I actually love the subtitle, Transforming Fear into Action to Change Your Life and the World. And that's really what it's all about. And what was the question you asked? Sorry.
Well, in reality, I mean, it's fascinating. Tell me, how you ended up writing this book, but also, your mindset on it, because this is obviously a shift in how your experience on this planet has played out from what you saw in the very beginning, and then understanding what was actually happening, your paradigm shift now into this new world that you're thinking about and how you want to heal the planet. Just kind of give us, the background on this book and how you actually played it out.
So, yeah, that's a great question. And I mentioned earlier, I've written 5 books on indigenous people and shamanism, books like The World is As You Dream It, Shape-Shifting Psychonavigation, and 4 books on global economics and intrigue, like Confessions of an Economic Hitman, which has sold more than 2 million copies now in almost 40 languages. But they seem like very, very distant, very disparate ends of a spectrum, shamanism and economics to people. To me, there was always a connection, but I would speak at shamanic events or New Age events, or whatever you want to call them, at various conferences and so forth, and people would come up to me and say, "Hey, you're not that jerk, that economic hitman guy. You're not the same John Perkins out here." And then I would speak at international economic forums, like big ones sometimes with lots of corporate heads and so on, and they would come up during a wine tasting or whatever reception. They say, "You're not that woo guy that wrote those books on shamanism, are you?" And I was, to me there were always a connection, but I never made it explicit. The connection is how we use perceptions to mold reality. That's the shamanic view. It's also the corporate view. It's also modern psychotherapy is based on changing reality through changing perceptions, quantum physics, advertising, all of it. And so I wrote this book as to connect those two. And as in all my writing, it's narrative nonfiction. I tell stories that I think are fun, exciting, sometimes scary, because I think people really relate to stories. They're true stories. But it also ties in, like, what is the death economy? What is the life economy? How did we get there? What are the stories behind it? And then what can each of you do? So one of the themes is, what can you do? What can each reader do to turn things around? And so I wrote this book to really make that bridge and also provide an opportunity for people who are interested in shamanism to really learn in a fun way about what's going on with this death economy and how we use shamanism, how we use perception to turn that around, and people who are interested in corporate affairs and economics to understand the role that the idea of shamanism has to play in that. So it really was written as a bridge and as a way of showing the power that each of you, each of your listeners, everybody out there has. We all have tremendous power to turn things around. And it's been amazing to me. I had no idea, of course, when I wrote the book that it would come out at a time of a global pandemic. or all this incredible racial dialogue that's going on, and tension, and awareness, new awareness. But I did know when I wrote the book that we were going through times of having once in 100-year events every year or so, massive hurricanes, earthquakes, fires, things like that we were just going through this time when the earth is speaking to us, whether you look at it scientifically or shamanically, it's speaking to us. And I knew that. But as it turns out, it's a perfect book for these times of the coronavirus and all this stuff around racial inequality is pushing us, everybody on the globe, to take a really good look at who we are as human beings on this planet and where do we want to go. We live on a very fragile space station, the Earth, and we humans are the pilots. And we've been driving the space station toward disaster. And so it's time to reboot the navigation system and to repilot ourselves. And I think we're really being forced right now on a global level to take a good look at who we are and where we go with all this.
It's so fascinating you said that, because it's funny in my world. I have liberal people who call me super conservative, and then I have super conservative people that call me super liberal, because I just focus on the truth, and I live in natural health care, but I also follow some conservative principles, and I love it because you break down this whole label process and the fact that they really are just a form of propaganda, because ultimately, whether it's considered woo-woo or it's considered more conservative, it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, we need to heal our planet. And I love how you talk about that, and the whole confronting or touching the jaguar, either way you say it, I know your book is touching the jaguar, is the fact that we are in the world right now, no matter what, we are having to confront some real ugly truths about not only our country, but our planet in general and how it's been operating behind the scenes. And talk to us a little bit about touching the jaguar, because I work with it in a self-development as well. And my biggest wins in life, and I'm sure yours as well, it sounds like, is when you confronted something very difficult that you had not wanted to been looking at your whole life. And once you did it and found out it really wasn't a big of a deal as you originally thought, and that's when you were freed from that thing.
So, let me give you an example. When I was in high school, I thought I was a really good writer. I won the short story prize, and I was editor of the newspaper, and I went to college and majored in English. My freshman year, I had an English teacher who was a well-known writer, and I had tremendous respect for him. I was very excited to be studying with him. He hated my writing. He never gave me anything above a C. It so discouraged me that I quit school. There were some other reasons, but that was the main reason. And when I eventually went back to college, I studied business administration, economics. I wouldn't write anymore. That hurt me so much, because I loved writing so much, and it destroyed my confidence, and I stopped writing. And then that's a big jaguar. There was a big blockage there. And then many years later, when I decided I really wanted to write, I thought back about this teacher, and I realized he's just a man with an opinion. And I realized that he had been highly critical of Bob Dylan's writing. Bob Dylan won the Nobel Prize in Literature, for heaven's sake.
Right.
So, I realized I don't need to listen to this guy's voice up here. It's kind of like my mother, or whatever voice was telling me that the food and drink were going to make me sick. Stop listening to those voices. And to realize that I could write, and by God, I was going to, and I've been very successful as a writer since then. So I think that's an interesting aspect of it. And I will say that many years later, when I wrote Confessions of an Economic Hitman, it was rejected by 39 publishers, Jason.
Wow.
Yes. Wow. It ended up on the New York Times bestseller list for about a year and a half and sold 2 million plus copies. But it was rejected by 39 publishers. And about the 7th rejection I got, I kind of wanted to, I can't go through this anymore. I'm giving up. I'm not going to send it out anymore. But then I remembered, I had to touch that jaguar too. And I remembered that college professor. And so I'd say every time I got a rejection list, well, that editor probably had a fight with her spouse at breakfast. Just put everything in the rejection pile. My book happened to come across her desk at the wrong moment. Or this editor doesn't like my politics. Or whatever. I don't know what the truth was, but I would create these stories that would say, well, these people are just, these are just voices. These editors aren't gods. Just because they're an editor at Random House or Penguin or wherever, it doesn't mean anything. I can keep going. I got to keep going. And I did. I kept going. And finally, the 40th try accepted it, and it became a big seller. So I think, as we look at, every one of us has a way of looking at this. And in the book, in Touching the Jaguar, I provide this practice that we can do for 8 or 10 minutes every day or once a week, whenever we want. And it's based on 5 questions that kind of address all of those things. And I can go into those if you want in a minute or whenever you want me to. But it's a fairly simple process that opens us up to touching the Jaguar, basically.
Beautiful. Yeah. Give people a couple different tips on that, because I know everyone comes from a different spirituality background, different faith background, and but yeah, go ahead, give them some tips, because I think people would, I deal in natural health, and so I see people that come in that medical has given them labels all day long, and they take on that label, and then they fail to confront the things in their life, like lifestyle, they're actually holding them back. It's not the label, it's their own mind. So yeah, go for it.
Right. Yeah. So there's a daily process that's outlined in the book, but it's based on these 5 basic questions. The first question we ask ourselves is, what do I most want to do for the rest of my life? What will bring me the greatest satisfaction? What will bring me the greatest bliss? If I'm lying on that proverbial deathbed looking back, what am I most happy that I did with my life? Or what do I regret that I didn't do? And then realize that this is now the time to do it. And I'll give an example. For me, it's write. I love to write. I want to keep writing. I have a friend who's a carpenter. For him, it's kind of the opposite end. He doesn't write, but he likes to work with his hands and wood. So the second question is, how do I tie this in to helping other people? Because we all feel better if we help someone else. It might be one other person, or it might be the whole world. And so for me as a writer, I'd say I want to write stories that inspire people to create better lives for themselves and a better world for all of us. That's what I want to do. For my carpenter friend, he would say, I want to work only with sustainable materials. And the third question is, what's blocking you? What are the barriers? What's the Jaguar that's standing there saying you can't do that? Well, for a writer, I already gave one example of the college professor, but another one might be, a writer might say, I just don't have time in the day to start writing things. I got a day job, and I want to write, but I don't have time. And for my carpenter, it might be that he'd say, well, my clients don't want to pay more money to use sustainable materials. They just don't want to pay the extra money. And so the fourth question then is, when you touch the Jaguar, well, how does that change your perception? So for the writer, it might be, well, wait, I could get up half an hour earlier and write for half an hour, or I could watch an hour less of television every night and write for an hour every night, or maybe it's 3 nights a week, but I can make the time to do that. And for my carpenter friend, he touches the Jaguar, and the Jaguar says, tell your clients that it's not a cost, sustainable materials, increased price. It's not a cost, it's an investment. They're investing in the future for themselves and their children and grandchildren. And then the fifth question is, what actions do I take today? And for a writer, well, I got to write. And for the carpenter, it's, well, I got to go out there and build a cabin or start working on a house. And I don't have to write poetry, but I guess, no, hey, look, you can tell your son, we just built this cabinet here out of total sustainable materials. You tell your son or your daughter, and look, we did it because of your future, son, daughter. We did this. We cost us a little more, but it's like investing in education or anything else. We did it as an investment in your future. And so I think, we can all go through this process. It doesn't matter what your career is, what your position in life is. You can ask yourself, what do you most want to do for the rest of your life? How does this tie in with helping other people? What's blocking you from doing it? When you touch that blockage, touch that Jaguar, how can you change your perception to allow you to move forward? And then 5, what actions do you take every day? And the last 3 questions may change every day or so. So the writer gets through, okay, so I'm gonna write for half an hour every morning. I'm gonna get up a little earlier. But then, okay, and he's doing, and I'm doing it as a writer. But then I got to get up in the morning and say, yeah, but what am I going to write about today? What do I want to write about? Oh, I want to write about what's going on in the race riots right now, in the demonstrations in my city, Seattle. I want to write about that. Oh, but the blockage is, well, I don't really know enough about it to write about it. And then but you touch the Jaguar, and the Jaguar says, well, go online and learn more about it, and write from your heart, write what you're feeling. So we can go through this process, basically every day, changing those last three questions and the answers. And every time we confront a new Jaguar and touch it and break through that barrier, we rise to a higher level of consciousness. And we get a great deeper satisfaction of who we are and what our relationship is to the planet and to each other. It's an amazing process that opens us to continually increasing our consciousness, increasing our level of satisfaction with our lives.
That's actually beautifully stated, and I love the fact that you have just action items, because ultimately that's where people sometimes get stuck, is they don't have action items. So your list is actually, I mean, that's super enlightening right there, just because it allows people to look at it and then go out and actually do it. So thank you for that, because you're going to help a ton of people right now with just that message. So much appreciated. Before we head out today, John, I would love to ask this very broad question. You can go wherever you want to, and I don't care from what ideology you come from. It doesn't matter if it's liberal, conservative, libertarian, or any other label you can think of. How do you want to see, knowing all of your work that you've done over all your life, how do you want to see America and then planet Earth? What do you want to see what it looks like in the next 5-10 years? What do you see based on your experiences?
Thanks, Jason. Yeah, for asking that. And I just going back to the other thing, I'd say that if people want to go into that process deeper, so those are 5 questions, but there's a daily process. And if they go to touchingthejaguarbook.com or johnperkins.org, they can actually get a little workbook for free that takes them through the process. It's also in the book itself at the end, but just there is a process there.
Perfect.
Let's see. So, I think that we've seen, even before the coronavirus and so forth, that we were headed in this direction of moving toward a life economy. The B corporations, benefit corporations. And incidentally, my publisher was the first publisher to go to a benefit corporation, B corporation. We've seen the movement toward conscious capitalism and the Green New Deal. And we saw last August, 192 of the world's most powerful executives came together at the Business Roundtable. And they came up with a statement that it should no longer be short-term profits, that maximization of short-term profits that drive their businesses. They said that. And basically they said we need to move to a life economy. And now we, the people, consumers, investors, employees, we need to push these executives to follow through on this, because they need to hear from us. Social networking gives us this opportunity to tell them, because they need to be able to take the fact that we're all writing to them and saying, hey, we love your product, but we're not going to buy it anymore until you clean up the pollution you've caused, or pay your workers in Indonesia a fair wage, or whatever the issue is. Because, if they just move forward with policies that are green and they lose market share, they'll lose their jobs. Their main stockholders will fire them and replace them with someone who only cares about market share. So we need to give them the ammunition to take to their major stockholders and say, these are our customers. We've got to listen. So, I'd like to see us move increasingly toward this life economy, to put on the cover of Time magazine, Person of the Year, and on Forbes and all these other magazines, not the guy who makes the most profits or the woman who makes the most profits, but the ones that are moving us toward a long-term life economy. And that's an economic system that pays people, that pays investors decent rates of return, and hires people to clean up pollution. To come up with processes to mine all the plastic that's in the oceans and clean up all the oil that's leaked around gas stations everywhere and oil drilling sites and so forth. To pays people to regenerate destroyed environments, so many destroyed environments around this planet, and to come up with new technologies that recycle, that are much more efficient even than we have today for solar and wind energy and using the air. I mean, there's a huge, amazing opportunity here. So let's say, if you're an American taxpayer, more than $50 on every $100 you pay in taxes to the U.S. government goes to the military. More than 50% in the discretionary budget goes to the military. And for the most part, the military is building kind of obsolete things like aircraft carriers and and missiles and equipment that in this time of cyber warfare, when the Russians and the Chinese are getting so good at cybernetics, we don't really need a lot of those investments. Imagine if your tax dollars, or some portion of that $50, went instead to pay the same companies, General Dynamics, Raytheon, the brilliant engineers, as well as entrepreneurs, to come up with new technologies that are regenerative, renewable, that create a better life for us, and that hire lots of people to do this kind of work. So the life economy that I'd like to see happen over the next 5 years, it's begun to happen. And I'd like to see it move more and more in that direction, that we're really getting our corporations and all of us to do a much better job at creating jobs, at creating opportunities to create a long-term future that our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren will look back and thank us for. And I think we have a tremendous opportunity right now to do that. I think all of your listeners, all of us are blessed to be alive at this time when this opportunity is there. Yes, the suffering, I'm sorry, the terrible people dying and getting sick from the coronavirus. I'm not trying to play that down, but we're being pushed also to be better, and the opportunities are there for each one of us to take advantage of.
Yeah, I really appreciate that vision, and I fully agree on most all points. And it really is. I think it's so funny because no matter what label again you look at, like everything in there, most of us can agree on, and we have to find our core common values, and the fact that no matter who it is, whatever side you fall on, I think all of us can agree we need a future for our children. We need a future of renewable resources. I mean, I live in Florida. If you live in the southern regions of the U.S., if you don't have solar on your roof, it's insane not to have solar. You know what I mean? Like certain things like that. There's nobody that can argue with plastic being taken out of our waters and our oceans and killing our sea, etc. So I appreciate that, because I think we can all get on board certain values like that, and we can push that forward. And you are definitely one of the leaders out there doing that. So I really appreciate it. Can you show everyone your book again before we head out, so that we can make sure everyone gets a copy and follows you, sir? Beautiful.
Yeah. Love to. Isn't that a great Jaguar?
It's a great Jaguar.
And again, go to johnperkins.org or touchingthejaguarbook.com, and you can get the workbook for free, and join an amazing Facebook group of people that every couple of weeks we have guests. I've had shamans from South America doing a fire ceremony on there, interviewing business leaders, and so on and so forth. So I'd really encourage people to do that. And you can see right behind me here too, there's a little Jaguar looking over my shoulder. So touching the Jaguar.
I love it.
Transforming fear into action to change your life and the world. Thank you so much, Jason.
Absolutely, John. I appreciate your time, and thank you again for being obviously a mentor to many, because so many people are reading your books. You have literally changed lives, and you're going to continue that. So thank you for being on the show. I appreciate your time and all your value.
Thank you, Jason. Keep doing what you're doing, please. It's so important with the word that you're spreading out there, looking at all sides of the issues. I really appreciate that. I appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Jason Dean, Revolution Network, today with John Perkins. Go get his book. Go follow his information. He's a brilliant man. You guys have an amazing day. Share this around, because this is how we change our world, by sharing viewpoints, by sharing positive vibes to everybody out there, and we will change our planet for the better. Have an amazing day. We'll see you live tonight. Dr. Jason Dean, Revolution Network, signing off. Be well.